Okay, so the first one I want to look at is his talk about hierarchies. It's going to take me a while to unpack this because I first want to summarise his own line of thinking and then talk about what my issue is with it. So the first chapter of his book is Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back, and it's a talk about exactly that, hierarchies. And he starts with lobsters and talks about how the biggest, strongest lobster gets the best patch and access to the hottest women and all of that kind of thing, and that the brain pathway and chemistry responsible for a lobster's recognition of its position in the hierarchy is the same as we have in our own brains, in our own chemistry. He then goes on to look at the evolving complexities of hierarchies, and goes from lobsters to wolves and from wolves to chimpanzees, and talks about how it's not just the biggest, strongest wolf or the biggest, strongest chimpanzee that is leader of the pack, because the sociology is more complex. And so, with chimpanzees in particular, the biggest, strongest chimp, if he's just a ugly, vicious tyrant, well, 2 or 3 other chimps will get together and bring him down. And so, just being the biggest and the strongest is not enough. Yeah, you've got to be big and strong, but you also have to be able to negotiate relationships within the group in order to maintain your position. And he then goes on to talk about human hierarchies, and that human hierarchies are a whole new evolution of the concept, because within human society we can create new hierarchies. And so you have hierarchies of builders, you have hierarchies of musicians, you have hierarchies of accountants, and so on and so on and so on. So we have lots and lots of different hierarchies, and in a healthy society there are sufficient variety of hierarchies that everybody can find a position of some significance in some hierarchy somewhere or other, and therefore find some meaning and some purpose in their lives. He then talks about how all hierarchies are susceptible to, or tilt towards, I think is the phrase that he uses, corruption and tyranny. And that you can recognise corruption and tyranny taking place in a hierarchy when people exercise power and influence in order to ascend the hierarchy rather than merit. That a healthy hierarchy, people ascend the hierarchy because they're good at doing that thing, so it's merit, it's competence is the word that he uses, which allows a healthy hierarchy to be ascended. And with all of that, I broadly agree. I don't take issue with any of that. I think it's a very well laid out schema. However, where I do take issue with him is where he starts to talk about how Western society is broadly healthy hierarchies because they are based on competence. And he gives the example of how you don't have bands of tyrannical plumbers going up and down the streets demanding that you use their services, that plumbers are selected on the basis of their ability to do the job when you want it to a sufficiently high level of competence. And again, I agree with all of that. Where I think I don't know if he willfully omits it or simply doesn't fully appreciate it, or maybe simply disagrees with what I'm about to say. But the hierarchies in which all other hierarchies are embedded are those where the true power resides. So we're talking about finance, we're talking about government and politics, we're talking about corporate influence. And all other hierarchies are embedded within that, particularly the money hierarchy. I mean, you can't really get anything done in this world without the use of money in some way or another. And so, those that control the super hierarchies, if you like, in which all of the others are embedded, are at a significant advantage. And I think he profoundly underestimates the degree to which our super hierarchies are indeed corrupt. And I give as examples the revolving door that exists between high levels of government and finance. I mean, one example that springs to mind is Hank Paulson, who, previously senior executive at Goldman Sachs, becomes Treasury Secretary at the time of the crash, allows Lehman Brothers to collapse, while at the same time, insisting that AIG get bailed out because AIG held huge contracts for Goldman Sachs, which Goldman Sachs were, I think, I could be wrong about this, I think the number was $7 billion of payouts AIG were due to make to Goldman Sachs in insurance payouts, and had they gone under, they wouldn't have been able to do that. Look at the Iraq War. Look at the bonus payments made to bankers after the financial crash. Look at the amount of lobbying that goes on. Look at the Buckley and Valeo and Citizens United decisions, which respectively defined corporations as people and defined money as speech. And so corporations can now spend as much money as they want on buying political influence. These hierarchies are deeply, deeply corrupted. And I have a little bit of an issue with his blasé sweeping off as Western society is broadly functional. Yeah, there's little bits of corruption here and there, but it's broadly functional. I disagree with that profoundly. I think that our super hierarchies, as I referred to them early on, the real controlling hierarchies, are controlled by a very few people for their own ends. I don't think there can be any doubt of that in the light of all the stuff that we've seen since the advent of the internet. And so when Jordan Peterson talks about the correct level of analysis for getting at the root causes of the problems of society is the individual, I broadly agree with that. However, when there are systemic barriers to that occurring, then those systemic barriers need to be examined very carefully. And I think there's a big gap in the fairness of his expectation when you look at the way that individuals and nations are hamstrung by some deeply flawed systems that we have. I mean, just one, for example, our system of money. Because 97% of money is created as debt, and debt carries interest, you have this constant, ever-increasing shortfall in the money supply, with a greater and greater demand on the existing supply of money to be paid out in interest payments, so less and less to actually go around and do commerce. That it necessarily impoverishes increasing numbers of people, and this is what we see going on around us. And it's all very well saying that, lifted this many people out of starvation, and this many children are getting this much more to eat, and blah blah blah. But this is not the idea that things are broadly getting better. This is not most people's experience, certainly not in the working and middle classes of the developed world. One final thought on this is Jordan Peterson's use of the Pareto distribution to justify as too strong, but to explain as somewhat inevitable very large disparities of wealth in society. And again, I don't deny the existence of the Pareto distribution. My issue with this line of thinking is that whatever inequality in resource distribution might naturally manifest themselves, we have chosen systems which exacerbate that. We have a system of money where essentially, it's obviously more complex than this, but essentially rich people lend money to poor people because rich people have a surplus of money, so they lend it to poor people at interest who pay it back with interest. And so rich people accumulate more money and poor people get poorer because they're having to pay money to rich people. And yeah, sure, a few poor people strike it rich and become rich people, but for the most part, it's a game where money is inevitably drawn away from most people towards a very, very few people. And he talks about Maslow's hierarchy as being flawed because if you accept the reality of Maslow's hierarchy, then rich people must necessarily be more moral than poor people because they've had more of their needs met and therefore they've ascended higher up the hierarchy. And we all know from our own daily experience that rich people are no more moral than poor people. But the fact of the matter is, it's very much easier to think about, working on yourself as an individual if your base needs are met. And while very, very large numbers of people are basically living hand to mouth, struggling to survive day to day, they don't have time to think about themselves. They don't have time to think about society at large. They don't have time to educate themselves or broaden their minds. You know what I mean? They're busy raising kids on no money. So I think he does a disservice to reality, if you like, by failing to acknowledge fully the extent to which people are disempowered by systemic barriers.